In the heart of Southeast Asia, nestled between Indonesia and Australia, lies a small nation of East Timor, a land of breathtaking beauty, rich culture, and a people with a profound history of suffering.
Hundreds of people were gunned down in the streets, in schools. Live grenades were thrown into houses.
Armed militia opposed to independence are on a murderous rampage.
We have to escape from the militia.
This is the story of the genocide in East Timor, a forgotten chapter in human history, marked by unimaginable brutality and the enduring spirit of a people longing for freedom. For over 4 centuries, East Timor was a Portuguese colony, isolated from the world, and largely untouched by the global conflicts of the 20th century. In 1975, the winds of change swept across the world as decolonization movements spread through Africa and Asia. Portugal, weakened by its own political unrest and colonial wars, decided to withdraw from its far-flung territories, including East Timor. Portugal's exit left East Timor on the cusp of independence, but also in a fierce political struggle, as different factions emerged with opposing political ideologies. 3 main factions emerged: the Timorese Democratic Union, the UDT, the Revolutionary Front for an Independent East Timor, FRETLIN, and the pro-Indonesian UPDETI. This led to civil war sparking within the region, with violent conflict between UTD and FRETLIN. At the time, Portugal did very little to prevent these tensions. On the 20th of August 1975, FRETLIN forces met and defeated a UD force at Ilo, then moved towards the capital Dili. FRETLIN had now become the dominant faction within the region. Whilst the civil war had sparked within East Timor, the situation at hand was being closely monitored by their bordering neighbours, Indonesia, who felt that the socialist left-leaning group FRETLIN could spark a communist political awakening and uprising within the region. They felt that the instability of a tiny new country could encourage separatism within Indonesia. East Timor also had an abundance of natural oil reserves. The Western powers and Australia saw the mid-70s as a dark and precarious time for Southeast Asia as a whole. The Cold War was still raging, and the threat of communism had never felt greater. It looked like a wave of communism could sweep over and engulf Southeast Asia at any moment. After the events in Vietnam, the instability of the new socialist-leaning country within the region concerned America and Australia, and they thought that East Timor would be better with Indonesia. Australia also recognised East Timor's natural oil reserves. With America's and Australia's fear of Southeast Asia becoming a hotbed for communism, there was a silent assurance and support from the world's global superpowers towards Indonesia, providing their backing and finances. On November 28, 1975, FRETLIN boldly declared East Timor's independence from Portugal. This moment was a culmination of years of struggle and aspiration, and for the Timorese people, it was a dream finally realised. Across the border in Indonesia, tensions began to rise towards East Timor. President Suharto, who come to power in the wake of a bloody anti-communist purge, viewed East Timor with growing suspicion. The rise of FRETLIN, with its socialist ideals and rumoured links to global communist movements, set off alarms in Jakarta, the capital of Indonesia.
The title, FRETLIN, the Revolutionary Front, it sounds communist. Is it in fact communist?
Well, I have always denied, reject strongly that FRETLIN is a communist party. It is not. It is a front that unites all Timorese patriots, all nationalists, without discrimination of race, religion, of political belief.
In the final months of 1975, there was rumours that in Jakarta, Indonesia's military was mobilising. This caused widespread fear across East Timor. However, the Timorese people would not have been able to predict the danger and brutality that was yet to come. Woven within the fabric of the wider story of East Timor lies many smaller and tragic tales of loss and bravery, whereby many innocent individuals suffered gravely at the hands of war. On the ground, a chilling event took place which shocked the world and became a symbol of the dangers faced by journalists covering conflict zones. A group of 5 young Australian-based journalists who paid the ultimate price for uncovering the truth. Greg Shackleton, Tony Stewart, Gary Cunningham, Malcolm Rennie, and Brian Peters, set out from Australia to report on the rapidly deteriorating situation. Stationed in the small town of Balibo, just a few kilometers from the Indonesian border, their mission was to expose the looming threat of the Indonesian invasion of East Timor to the international community. But the Indonesian military were aware that the journalists could reveal their covert incursions, and they saw them as a threat. On October 16, 1975, the Indonesian forces launched an assault on Balibo, capturing and killing the 5 journalists. The exact circumstances of their deaths have been shrouded in controversy, but eyewitness reports and investigations suggest that the journalists were deliberately targeted to prevent their footage from exposing the illegal invasion. The Indonesian government initially claimed that the Balibo 5 had been caught in a crossfire. However, over the years, evidence suggests that the journalists had been executed at close range, and efforts were undertaken to conceal the crime. The deaths of the Balibo 5 sparked outrage across Australia and beyond. For years, their families and colleagues wanted accountability for the killings. Despite multiple investigations, justice has remained elusive, with Indonesian authorities denying responsibility and key witnesses silenced or unwilling to testify. In 2007, an Australia coroner ruled that the Balibo 5 were deliberately killed by Indonesian forces to prevent them from reporting on the invasion. The inquest concluded that their deaths amounted to a war crime, though no one has been prosecuted to this day.
Our understanding of the issues is that they were killed during the crossfire. So that's our understanding, and that's...
And if you were wrong?
Well...
That means one of your Indonesian countrymen is a murderer.
War is war. To be killed in the crossfire in the line of war, it's a risk that anyone can happen.
War is not war, sir. When those men were killed walking down the middle of the street with their hands in the air.
That's the understanding of your side.
Just 9 days after the East Timorese Declaration of Independence, and 3 days after the death of the Balibo 5, Indonesia launched a full-scale invasion of East Timor. On the morning of December 7, 1975, Indonesia launched Operation Sarajevo, one of the largest military invasions in Southeast Asia's modern history. Waves of naval ships and aircraft closed in on East Timor's capital, Dili. The assault was swift and devastating. Indonesian paratroopers descended from the skies, and soldiers stormed the beaches, overwhelming the lightly defended city of Dili. Indonesian forces bombarded Dili from the air and sea, indiscriminately targeting military and civilian areas alike. Within hours, thousands of Timorese were killed or displaced, their homes destroyed by a foreign military, intent on crushing the fledgling independence movement. For the Timorese, the scale of the violence was overwhelming. Indonesian troops, equipped with modern weaponry and overwhelming force, seized control of key towns and villages. Their orders were clear: eliminate any resistance and take full control of the territory. Fredlin fighters, though brave, were no match for the Indonesian military machine. With the capital under control, Indonesian forces began a systematic campaign of occupation. Villages were destroyed, families were torn apart, and tens of thousands of civilians were forced into concentration camps or relocated to strategic hamlets, where they were monitored and controlled.
Hundreds of people were gunned down in the streets, in schools, in shops, in their homes, in the hospital. Live grenades were thrown into houses. The Indonesian troops had been told that the East Timorese were communists and primitives who threatened the very existence of Indonesia itself. The strategy was clearly to terrorize an entire nation.
Though the invasion was met with international outcry, the response of the world powers was muted. Indonesia's strategic importance in the Cold War era as a staunchly anti-communist nation meant that the Western governments, particularly the United States and Australia, turned a blind eye to the atrocities unfolding in East Timor.
We were providing most of the weaponry, helicopters, logistical support, food, uniforms, ammunition, all the expendables that the Indonesians needed to conduct this war.
In the halls of diplomacy, the fate of the Timorese people was largely ignored. Although the United Nations condemned the invasion, calling for Indonesia's withdrawal and East Timor's right to self-determination, but these resolutions remained largely symbolic as the world hesitated. Indonesia tightened its grip on the territory, and the people of East Timor were left to fend for themselves. The years that followed were marked by unimaginable suffering. The Indonesian military cracked down on any signs of resistance, committing widespread human rights abuses, including torture, executions, and the deliberate starvation of entire communities. The dream of independence, once so close, had now turned into a nightmare. As the years rolled on, the Indonesian occupation was marked with a series of atrocities, massacres, forced disappearances, and the targeting of civilians.
To many Timorese, their glistening ocean is still known as the Sea of Blood. People were brought here to die in groups, and as in Cambodia, often the first to die were the educated, public officials, teachers, students, nurses. One eyewitness reported the words of an Indonesian officer who, when asked to justify the mass killing of women and children, said, "When you clean the fields, don't you kill all the snakes, both large and small?"
Human rights organizations estimate nearly a third of the population died as a result of the conflict through violence, starvation, or disease. The world remained largely silent as East Timor suffered in isolation. On November 12, 1991, the people of East Timor gathered in quiet defiance, determined to honour their fallen comrades. What began as a peaceful demonstration would soon descend into one of the most horrific acts of violence in the country's long struggle for freedom: the Santa Cruz Cemetery Massacre. For nearly 2 decades, East Timor had endured a brutal occupation by Indonesian forces. The invasion of 1975 had sparked a resistance movement that refused to be silenced, even in the face of overwhelming violence and oppression. By the early 1990s, the world was beginning to take notice, but the risks for those who stood up against Indonesian rule remained immense. The demonstration on that fateful day was sparked by a funeral, a tribute to a young Timorese independence activist who had been killed by Indonesian forces. Hundreds of mourners, mostly young men and women, marched from the motel church to the Santa Cruz Cemetery, carrying symbols of defiance, the banned flag of Fretlin, the movement for independence. Tensions were high, but the march remained peaceful. The protesters knew the risks that they were taking. Indonesian troops had been stationed throughout Dili, watching, waiting, but they believed in their cause, and they hoped that the world was watching too. As the crowd reached the cemetery, their numbers swelled with raised fists and chants for independence. They demanded an end to the occupation, to the violence, to the years of suffering, but the hope that had brought them together was about to be met with unimaginable brutality. Without warning, the Indonesian soldiers opened fire. By the time the gunfire stopped, more than 250 Timorese were dead or wounded. Hundreds more were arrested in the aftermath, disappearing into the hands of the Indonesian security forces, never to be seen again. Among the protesters that day were foreign journalists whose cameras captured the slaughter as it unfolded for the first time. The world saw the brutality of the Indonesian occupation of East Timor. Footage of the massacre spread across the world, sparking outrage and calls for action. The Santa Cruz massacre marked a turning point in the international community's awareness of East Timor's plight. But for years, little action was taken. The Indonesian government dismissed the massacre as an unfortunate incident, refusing to accept responsibility for the atrocities committed.
A statement by Amnesty International described the situation there as one of arbitrary arrest, torture, disappearance, executions, and massacre. Are they lying?
Yes, I think
Amnesty is lying, really.
they are not. They have no
corroborated evidence.
The Santa Cruz cemetery massacre was a tragedy of unspeakable violence, but it was also a turning point in East Timor's struggle for freedom. It was a moment when the world could no longer ignore the suffering of the Timorese people, a moment where their cries for justice rang out across the globe. Though the path of independence would take nearly a decade longer, the courage and the sacrifice of those who marched that day ensured that their fight would not be in vain. The blood spilled at Santa Cruz was the price of freedom, and in the end, it would help pave the way for East Timor's liberation. As the 1990s progressed, the struggle for independence in East Timor reached a critical juncture. The island, long subjected to Indonesian occupation, was on the cusp of a historic turning point. But the path to freedom would be fraught with violence and turmoil as East Timor faced one of its darkest hours. In 1999, after years of guerrilla warfare and international advocacy, the United Nations finally arranged for a referendum to determine East Timor's future. The Timorese were given a choice to remain part of Indonesia or to become an independent nation. The decision marked a critical moment in their struggle. On August 30th, 1999, the people of East Timor cast their votes. The result was a resounding endorsement of independence, with over 78% of the population choosing to break away from Indonesia. But this victory came at a high price. In response to the referendum's outcome, pro-Indonesian militias, backed by elements of the Indonesian military, unleashed a wave of terror across East Timor. Violence erupted on an unprecedented scale. Towns were razed, homes were destroyed, and countless lives were lost as militias waged a campaign of revenge and destruction. As the violence spread, an estimated 200,000 East Timorese were displaced from their homes, seeking refuge in the mountains or in makeshift camps.
Timor, tende ukunaan. Dan ami kuliah bibikan sana sira odi ami.
This young man was in the village of Galatas when the attack began. He hid nearby as his grandfather and two cousins were killed.
The international community watched in alarm as reports of atrocities and humanitarian crises emerged from the devastated region. In the face of escalating violence, the international community intervened. The United Nations authorized a multinational force to restore order and provide relief. The International Force for East Timor, INTERFET, led by Australia, arrived in September 1999, bringing with it a glimmer of hope and the promise of security. The arrival of INTERFET marked a turning point. The multinational forces moved quickly to stabilize the situation, disarm militias, and protect the civilian population. Slowly but surely, the chaos began to recede, and East Timor started its journey towards recovery and reconstruction. Although not everything went smoothly for the INTERFET peacekeeping force, during 1999, several allegations of brutality committed by members of the Australian SAS towards the pro-Indonesian militia arose, leaving a dark stain on Australia's proudest military operation, and yet another atrocity woven into the fabric of East Timor's bloody past. The violence of 1999 marked a painful chapter in East Timor's long struggle. The international community intervened, with peacekeeping forces restoring order. But the road to independence was not just about survival. It was about rebuilding a nation from the ground up. A new generation of Timorese leaders emerged, leaders who had once fought in the mountains as guerrillas. Zanana Gusmao, the former leader of the resistance, would become the first president of a free East Timor.
I am thinking about the first stage. Reconstruction. Reconstruction in the physical terms, reconstruction also in the psychological terms.
His leadership, along with the determination of his people, would guide the young nation through its formative years. And so, on May 20th, 2002, under the eyes of the world, East Timor took its place as a sovereign nation. At midnight, the United Nations flag was lowered, and for the first time in history, the East Timorese flag was raised. Tears of joy flowed. It was a moment that generations had dreamed of, but few had believed would come. In his inaugural address, President Zanana Gusmao spoke not only of the past, but of the future. He acknowledged the immense sacrifices made, the lives lost, the hardships endured, but he also spoke of hope. Hope that East Timor would become a nation built on peace, justice, and unity.
Viva Timor-Leste!
Today, East Timor stands as a proud symbol of resilience. Its path to independence was long and fraught with suffering. They reclaimed their land, their identity, from the ashes of war and occupation. East Timor was reborn. However, decades of war and neglect have left deep scars, not only to the land, but the people themselves. The infrastructure destroyed during the conflict is still being rebuilt, and many communities remain isolated from essential services such as healthcare, clean water, and education. For much of the population, daily life remains a fight for survival. More than 40% of East Timor's people live in poverty, many in remote, rural areas where access to basic services is limited. Agriculture, the backbone of the economy, is often subsistence-based, with families relying on small plots of land to feed themselves. The scars of war are not just physical. Thousands of East Timorese still bear the emotional and psychological wounds of decades of conflict. Many survivors of the Indonesian occupation, especially those who endured torture, violence, and loss of loved ones, struggle with trauma that remains untreated. Indonesia, with a population of over 270 million, has risen to Southeast Asia's largest economy, a country rich in natural resources. It boasts a growing middle class, major industries, and a dynamic urban landscape. Cities like Jakarta and Surabaya are hubs of commerce and development, symbols of Indonesia's rapid modernization and global ambitions. The contrast between these two nations is stark. The brutal Indonesian occupation of East Timor from 1975 to 1999 has left deep scars, with over 200,000 deaths of the East Timorese people and countless atrocities committed. The memories of the occupation remain fresh in the minds of the Timorese people.
Those Timorese and their allies who refused to allow the unthinkable to be normalized, and whose tenacity is reflected in the eyes of people here, eyes that speak a resistance and defiance and courage. There is also a wider question. Are international relations at the close of the 20th century to be dominated by euphemisms and lies that override justice and make small nations expendable? The fate of the people of East Timor is pivotal to this. For if we allow our governments to arm their oppressors and steal their resources, and to do so in our name, how can we then claim the universal rights that are denied them?
Thank you for watching. Please like the video and subscribe to Proteus for more content.